If you walked along the eastern edge of Frank, Alberta, in the spring of 1903, your eyes would have been drawn to a neat, uniform row of buildings. 7 ordinary cottages nestled along the Gold Creek. Built from fresh pine that still carried the scent of the sawmill, they were home to 7 ordinary immigrant families, all chasing the same dream. They had crossed oceans to reach this narrow valley, lured by the promise of steady work in the booming coal mine. On the evening of the 28th of April, those little cottages were filled with the familiar rhythm of everyday life. In one, a mother mended socks by candlelight. Somewhere along the row, a piano played softly while children finished their supper. In the Clark family cottage, Amelia Clark coaxed her 6 younger children into bed before glancing out into the darkness, wondering whether her eldest daughter, Lillian, would make the cold walk home from her shift at the hotel. 7 ordinary cottages, 7 ordinary families, but one extraordinary town. As the last lamps were extinguished and Frank settled into silence beneath the limestone face of Turtle Mountain, the families felt safe. They looked at the massive, towering peak looming right over their backyards and saw a protector. They thought it sheltered them from the bitter Canadian winds. But during that night, the mountain began to move. In May 1901, the valley beneath Turtle Mountain was little more than trees, mud, and a newly discovered coal seam. Only a few years earlier, those rich seams had attracted the attention of 2 businessmen, Samuel Gibault and Henry L. Frank. Together they established the Canadian-American Coal and Coke Company, opening a mine at the mountain's base in the spring of 1901. Unlike many mining settlements that simply grew around a successful pit, Frank was built with ambition from the very beginning. They wanted a thriving community. To persuade people to settle there, they organised a grand opening celebration unlike anything the Crowsnest Pass had ever seen. Special excursion trains carried more than 1,400 visitors into the valley. Local newspapers advertised the celebration with a simple promise: pay only the rail fare and everything else would be free. Once they arrived, visitors were treated to a lavish outdoor banquet, as Frank and Gibault spared no expense. A ton of fresh fruit and ice cream was even brought in from Spokane for the occasion. Families were invited to tour the newly built cottages, while prospective miners were shown through the workings beneath Turtle Mountain. The gamble worked. Within 2 years, more than 600 people called Frank home, and before long, newspapers confidently predicted that this little mining town would one day become the Pittsburgh of Canada. For a town that had barely existed 2 years earlier, Frank was astonishingly modern. Most mining settlements of the era began as rough collections of wooden shacks, their muddy streets slowly expanding as more men arrived in search of work. Frank skipped that stage altogether. Backed by substantial investment, it had been planned from the outset as a permanent community rather than a temporary camp. Along Dominion Avenue, new businesses seemed to open almost every month. There were jewellery and clothing stores, a shoemaker, cafes, hotels, a photographer's studio, and even a local newspaper office. 2 doctors established practices, a dentist opened his doors, and a handsome 2-storey brick school welcomed the growing number of children arriving with their families. The town even generated its own electricity. For just 25 cents, homeowners could have electric lights installed in their living rooms, while a newly engineered waterworks system supplied running water to homes and businesses. These were comforts that many settlements, decades older than Frank, still lacked. People arrived from across Europe and Britain. Welsh, English and Scottish mining families settled alongside French, Italian, German and Slavic immigrants, bringing with them different languages, traditions and customs. They weren't simply passing through. They bought property, opened businesses, planted gardens and raised children. The school classrooms filled quickly. Sporting clubs were organised, churches gathered growing congregations, and neighbours came to know one another. The townspeople were so intoxicated by the extraordinary speed of their own success, so busy building a future, that they forgot to look up. Long before prospectors arrived in search of coal, the Blackfoot and the Katunaha peoples knew these mountains well. Among the stories carried from one generation to the next was a warning about the great limestone peak that loomed over the valley. They believed it was alive. They spoke of it as the mountain that moved. According to a tradition still repeated by ranchers and trappers throughout the district, indigenous people would not camp beneath its towering eastern face because they believed the mountain was unstable. The warning was no secret. It had become part of the folklore of the Crowsnest Pass, repeated often enough that most local people had heard some version of it. But there had never been any sign that Turtle Mountain posed an immediate danger. No devastating rockslide had thundered into the valley within living memory. The stories remained just that, stories. So the mine drove deeper into the mountain. Trees disappeared from its lower slopes. Dynamite echoed through the valley as men carved fresh tunnels into the limestone in search of coal. New homes appeared. Businesses prospered. Children played beneath cliffs that had stood for millions of years, while their parents built lives in the shadow of a mountain they believed they had finally mastered. They hadn't. After another ordinary day in Frank, Tuesday the 28th of April 1903 was drawing to a close. Several miles west of town, surveyor Raoul Green packed away his instruments after another day's work. Normally he left his surveying equipment hidden overnight, ready for the following morning. But this evening he didn't. "I've got a funny feeling," he told his assistant. Together they picked up the heavy equipment and began the walk back. Years later, Green would still be unable to explain why he had broken a routine he'd followed so many times before. Back in Frank, 15-year-old Lillian Clark finished a late shift at the local boarding house. She was getting ready to walk home when her friends persuaded her to stay the night instead. It would save the long walk back in the darkness, they joked, and she wouldn't have to rush into town again the following morning. Lillian hesitated. She had never spent a night away from her family before. Eventually, she agreed. Elsewhere in town, families settled in for the evening. Supper had been eaten. Children were being readied for bed. Some were already asleep. Not everyone, however, was heading to bed. As the evening wore on, the night shift made its way towards the Turtle Mountain mine. By midnight, Frank was quiet. Rising more than 2,000 metres above the valley floor, Turtle Mountain loomed in the darkness. As the town slept, the night shift worked deep beneath Turtle Mountain. 20 men and a horse were underground that night, spread through the maze of tunnels where the coal seams were being worked. It was an ordinary shift, following the same routine as every other. Just minutes before 4:10 a.m., Alex Clark, Lillian's father, joined fellow miners William Farrington and Tashigan in hauling another load of coal out to the mine tipple. With the wagon emptied, the three men settled down near the mine entrance to eat their lunches in the cool night air. It was the last time any of them would be seen alive. Then the mountain moved. The first sign was not a falling rock. It was the air. Without warning, an immense blast of compressed air burst through the mine workings, roaring along the tunnels with astonishing force. Safety lamps were blown out in an instant, and the men were plunged into darkness. But before anyone had time to react, the mountain came down. More than 100 million tons of limestone broke free from Turtle Mountain and accelerated into the valley below, reaching speeds estimated at well over 100 kilometers an hour. The impact was beyond anything the people of Frank had ever experienced. In those first bewildering moments, almost nobody knew what had happened. They knew only that the earth had shaken beneath their feet. An unimaginable roar had rolled through the valley, and the eastern edge of their town had vanished behind an impenetrable wall of dust. Company cottages were crushed in seconds. Homes vanished beneath a wave of limestone so deep that in places it buried entire buildings beyond sight. Trees were uprooted as though they were blades of grass. Gold Creek was buried, and the valley floor was transformed into a landscape of broken stone. For those caught in its path, there was no chance of survival. 15-year-old Lillian Clark slept through the disaster at the boarding house where she had agreed, almost at the last moment, to spend the night. She woke to a town she no longer recognized. Her family home had vanished beneath the slide. Her mother, brothers and sisters were gone, buried beneath thousands of tons of shattered limestone. Her father, Alex, who had been working the night shift at the mine, was presumed dead. Numb with shock, Lillian wandered through the devastated streets, searching for familiar faces, struggling to comprehend that everything she had known had disappeared in less than 2 minutes. Eventually, neighbours found the frightened teenager and took her into their care. At the Frank Hotel, Ellen Thornley was thrown clean out of bed as the building lurched beneath her. By the time she reached the street, men and women were already pouring from their homes in their nightclothes, some shouting that the mine had exploded, others convinced the end of the world had come. Out of the darkness came a young mother carrying a small child, both dressed only for bed. Without a second thought, Ellen slipped off her coat, wrapped it around them, and watched them disappear into the confusion. Elsewhere, John Anderson reached his bedroom window just in time to see what he thought was a great cloud of smoke rushing past his house. Only later would he realize it wasn't smoke at all, but a wall of dust thrown into the air by an entire mountainside collapsing across the valley. Not everyone understood the danger. One local man, known simply as Mormon Bill, steadied himself after the tremendous blast, decided he'd had too much whiskey, and went back to bed, completely unaware that only a short distance away families had already been buried beneath millions of tons of rock. The mine entrance disappeared beneath an avalanche of shattered rock. But deep inside the mountain, 17 miners were still alive. Led by their shift boss, Joe Chapman, they gathered in the darkness as they tried to reach the main entrance. They never made it. Where the tunnel had once opened into the valley, there was now only solid rock. They were sealed inside the mountain. The air quickly became thick with dust and the bitter smell of sulphur. Water began seeping into the workings, and every breath became harder than the last. For a few moments, nobody spoke. Then Evan Jones remembered something. High above the main workings was a narrow seam of soft coal that climbed steeply towards the upper reaches of the mountain. It had never been intended as an escape route. Now it was their only chance. Without hesitation, the men picked up their tools and began hacking their way upwards through the coal. Behind them, in the darkness of the abandoned workings, the pit pony wandered aimlessly. Above ground, the world had been transformed. In less than 100 seconds, an entire mountainside had crashed into the valley below. Where neat rows of miners' cottages had stood only moments before, there was now a landscape of shattered limestone stretching for more than a square kilometre. For those who had survived, the silence was almost as shocking as the roar that had preceded it. Then came the voices. At first only a few, then dozens. Men and women calling the names of husbands, wives, children and neighbours. Some began scrambling across the unstable rocks with bleeding hands, listening for the faintest reply from beneath the rubble. Others ran towards the mine, fearing that everyone underground had been lost. Across the slide, neighbours dug with picks, shovels, crowbars and bare hands. Every sound brought the hope that someone might still be alive. Every silence carried the fear that they were already too late. Beneath their feet, 17 miners were still fighting for their own lives. Joe Chapman and his men continued driving their way upwards through the narrow seam of coal. Hour after hour, the trapped miners hacked, taking turns with their picks as the tunnel crept upwards a few feet at a time. Time lost all meaning. There was no daylight, no way of knowing where the rescue had begun above them, or whether anyone even knew they had survived. And still they dug. As the hours dragged on, exhaustion began to claim the men one by one. Arms that had swung pickaxes for years could no longer be lifted. By the 13th hour, only 3 of the 17 miners still had the strength to keep digging. The others lay where they had collapsed, barely conscious, waiting for either rescue or the end. Then, at last, a pickaxe broke through and daylight poured through the opening. For a fleeting moment it seemed they had done it, but when they widened the hole, hope turned to disbelief. They had broken through directly beneath an unstable cliff. Great blocks of limestone, loosened by the slide, were still crashing down the mountainside. To climb out there would have been suicide. After 13 hours of digging, their escape route had led them into another trap. There was no choice but to keep going. Summoning the last of their strength, the 3 remaining miners changed direction, angling the tunnel away from the falling rock. Every swing of the pick demanded more than their exhausted bodies wanted to give, yet somehow they carried on. Then, once again, the coal gave way. This time the opening emerged beneath the shelter of a rocky outcrop. They had spent 13 hours entombed inside Turtle Mountain. Against all odds, every one of them had survived. By the time the 17 miners emerged from the mountain, the search below had been underway for hours. The neat little mining town they had left before dawn had almost disappeared. Where streets and gardens had once stood, there was only broken limestone. Entire homes had been swallowed beneath boulders the size of houses. Here and there, the roof of a cottage protruded from the endless field of rock, marking the place where a family still lay buried beneath. Horses wandered riderless through the valley. The familiar streets people had walked only the day before had vanished beneath an endless field of grey stone. Survivors searched for landmarks that no longer existed, trying to work out where their homes had once stood. Rescue parties had come from every direction. Miners abandoned their own shifts in neighbouring towns and hurried to Frank. Railway workers, ranchers, shopkeepers and farmers all joined the search. By the second morning the search had begun to change. The cries for help that had echoed across the slide grew fewer with each passing hour. One by one the missing were found. Some were discovered exactly where they had been sleeping. Others were found together, husbands beside wives, parents still clutching their children in their final moments. For many families there would be no farewell at all. The mountain had buried them too deeply to ever be recovered. As the grim task continued, the true scale of the disaster slowly emerged. Entire families had vanished. The Bansema family had almost been wiped out. Annie Bansema and several of her children were among the dead. Their father, Carl, survived only because he had spent the previous night at the family homestead east of Frank with his 2 eldest sons. The Clark home had disappeared beneath the slide, killing everyone in it. By sheer luck, Lillian survived. The same cruel pattern repeated itself across Frank. Someone's missed train, an extra shift here and there, or for Lillian, a night spent away from home. For some, the smallest change in routine had meant the difference between life and death. As the days passed, the official death toll continued to rise. No one could say with complete certainty how many people the mountain had claimed. Some victims were never found. Others were thought to have been passing through Frank and disappeared without trace. Even today, the exact number remains unknown. Most historians believe that somewhere between 70 and 90 people lost their lives beneath Turtle Mountain that April morning. The mountain had taken lives. It had also taken a town. The eastern end of Frank had simply ceased to exist, buried beneath a blanket of limestone that in places was more than 40 metres deep. Streets vanished from the map. Homes that had stood there the previous evening would never be seen again. In the weeks that followed, investigators discovered that Turtle Mountain had been giving warning signs long before that April morning. Miners had spoken of hearing rocks crack inside the mountain. Small rockfalls were common, Deep fissures had opened across the summit, and water had worked its way into the cracks before freezing during the harsh Canadian winters, slowly forcing the rock apart year after year. No single event caused the Frank Slide. It was the result of a mountain that had been weakening for thousands of years, until in less than 100 seconds gravity finally won. Yet remarkably, Frank's story did not end there. There was no question that haunted the town more than whether anyone could ever live beneath Turtle Mountain again. The answer came surprisingly quickly. Human beings have always had an extraordinary ability to carry on, especially when livelihoods are at stake. Coal was still in the mountain, wages still needed to be earned, and families still needed to eat. Just 3 weeks after the disaster, the Canadian Pacific Railway had been cleared, and trains were running once again. Within months the coal mine had reopened. Frank refused to disappear. Instead, it grew. New homes were built northwest of the devastated town, in a neighbourhood that became known as New Frank. Businesses returned. A zinc smelter was constructed. A grand 3-story hotel rose beside the sulphur spring, and by 1910 the population had climbed to almost 1,000 people. Life had returned to the valley, but no one who lived there could ever pretend the mountain wasn't watching. Only now a vast scar stretched across its eastern face, a permanent reminder of the few terrible seconds that had changed Frank forever. For years afterwards, people still spoke of that spring morning in hushed voices. They remembered the roar that had shaken the valley, the choking cloud of dust, and the desperate search that followed. Nearly 20 years later, road workers cutting a route through the slide uncovered the remains of 7 people. They were believed to be Lillian Clark's mother and her 6 brothers and sisters, finally bringing an end to one family's long disappearance. More than 120 years have passed since the eastern face of Turtle Mountain came crashing into the valley below. The slide remains almost exactly as it was left that April morning. Millions of tons of limestone still cover the landscape, and beneath those rocks, many of those who lost their lives have never been recovered. Standing there today, it's easy to be overwhelmed by the sheer scale of what happened. But the Frank Slide is more than a geological wonder or a tourist attraction. It is a place of memory, a place where ordinary families built lives, where neighbours looked after one another, and where, in the face of unimaginable loss, a community found the strength to begin again. Frank could have become another forgotten ghost town, abandoned beneath the shadow of the mountain. Instead, it rebuilt. And more than a century later, that spirit endures. And perhaps that is what makes Frank so extraordinary. Now, this disaster stunned me completely because it brought home how almost an entire community could be wiped out in just minutes. But it also showed the resilience of those who, in spite of their grief, remained to rebuild and thrive. I hope you appreciated the way the information was presented. I'll see you on the next one, and I'll wish you bye-bye for now.